All right, so get ready because today we're going deep on something a little bit different.
Wow.
Yeah, a listener sent us this piece, and, well, it's really intense and personal, like a diary entry almost.
Hmm.
It describes a really unusual encounter, and they're asking for our take on it.
Interesting.
Yeah, so we're going to try to figure out, like, what's going on in these characters' heads, like, what makes them tick.
Trying to analyze fictional characters is always fascinating,
Yeah,
but it can be tricky.
right?
I mean, we can't just, interview them
Yeah,
or ask them direct questions.
right.
But what we can do is we can look closely at what they do,
Okay.
what they say,
Mm-hmm.
for clues about their psychology and their motivations.
Okay, so where do we even begin with this one? This story is packed with intense stuff.
Well, I think we have to start with the elephant in the room,
Okay.
which is the power dynamic.
Yeah.
From the very beginning, it's so clear that there's just a huge imbalance between the two characters.
Right.
We'll call them, let's say, the mother and the son.
Got it.
Yeah,
And the language that she uses just really drives that point home.
it does.
Like calling him her god and talking about wanting to be treated like a nasty whore. It's,
Yeah, it's pretty jarring.
it is.
And it tells us right away that this isn't just about sex.
Yeah.
This is about power.
Okay.
The mother is very clearly using language to establish dominance
Mm-hmm.
and control the entire situation.
Yeah.
Almost like she's creating a specific role for herself in this,
Yeah.
like a persona she wants to embody.
And then there's this part where the son mentions learning about sex through porn.
Right.
And I can't help but wonder how that's shaped his expectations for what intimacy even is.
Oh, you've hit on a huge point there.
Okay.
There's actually a term for this in psychology.
What is it?
It's called sexual scripting.
Okay.
And it's basically the idea that we learn about sex and relationships
Mm-hmm.
from all kinds of sources. Media is a big one.
Sure.
And then these scripts can actually influence our behavior and expectations.
Mm-hmm. So, like, he's internalized these scenes or scenarios
Possible.
from porn,
Yes.
and now it's playing out in real life.
It's one way to interpret it, and it brings up a lot of questions.
Like what?
Well, is he confusing fantasy with reality?
Oh, interesting.
Is what's happening something he actually desires, or is he just following a script he thinks he's supposed to follow?
Yeah, especially with things like her wanting him to lick her clean after using the bathroom. It's
Yeah.
like so staged,
Sure.
almost like a scene straight out of a movie.
Exactly. And this leads us to consent,
Okay.
which is a very complex issue.
Right.
On the surface, it seems like she's giving him choices.
Mm-hmm.
But if his whole understanding of sex and relationships is coming from porn,
Right.
or if he feels this pressure to fulfill her desires,
Yeah.
the lines get really blurry.
It's like that detail you pointed out about him wanting to meet her expectations
Yeah.
makes me think, like, are his actions driven by genuine desire?
Right.
Or is it like obligation?
Right.
Or even coercion?
It's really ambiguous, and that so often happens when there's a big power imbalance.
Yeah.
The person with less power often feels like they have to comply,
Right.
even if they're not comfortable with it.
It's fascinating.
It is.
And a bit unsettling how much this story, even though it's fiction,
Yeah.
echoes stuff we see in real relationships.
It does, and it's especially interesting because it dives into territory that people don't usually want to talk about,
Okay.
like those darker, more taboo desires
Yeah.
that we usually keep hidden.
Like the specific language she uses?
Exactly. Some of those terms are loaded.
They are.
I definitely raised an eyebrow when I first read them.
Me too.
And that's significant.
Okay.
The language of kink, as it's sometimes called, carries a whole lot of meaning about power, control, and transgression.
So in this case, is she using those terms as just another way to be dominant?
It's possible.
Or is it more about her exploring her own desires, like maybe breaking free from norms?
It could be both
Yeah.
or something else entirely.
Okay.
Remember, she mentions not having intimacy for a long time.
Right.
And that suggests there's a deep longing there,
Yeah.
a desire for connection and validation.
Okay.
That goes way beyond just physical pleasure.
Which connects to what you said earlier about her emotional vulnerability.
Exactly.
That's like she's using this encounter to express all those deeper needs, that
Mhm.
hunger for affection.
And that's what makes this story so much more than just shocking or titillating.
Yeah, okay.
It forces us to confront this messy reality of human emotions
Right.
and how they can manifest in these unexpected and sometimes uncomfortable ways.
Yeah, this is definitely one of those deep dives that stays with you
It is.
long after you're done listening.
It is. And the fact that it's giving you pause, making you reflect,
Mm-hmm.
really speaks to the power of stories, even fictional ones.
Yeah.
We can find profound truths about ourselves
Okay.
and the world around us.
I'm already seeing this whole story differently.
That's what we aim for. By the time we're done, you'll have a much deeper understanding of
Right.
the psychology, not just in this story,
Right.
but in real relationships, too.
Okay, so we've got this power imbalance,
Yes,
possibly some blurring between fantasy and reality,
definitely.
and a whole lot of emotional baggage just swirling around.
That's a lot.
What else should we be paying attention to?
Well, one thing that really stands out to me is how this story tackles societal expectations
Okay.
around sex and intimacy.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it's almost like the mother's deliberately challenging them.
You know, you're right. There's that line where she talks about how women are expected to just swallow
Yes.
and not be grossed out by certain things.
It's like she's directly commenting on the double standards that women face
Totally.
when it comes to sexuality.
Yeah, it really adds to that power dynamic we were discussing.
It does.
Who gets to decide what's acceptable or pleasurable?
Exactly.
What's normal? And in this story, she's the one in control.
She is, and it's important to acknowledge that even within this dynamic, that could be problematic.
Okay.
She's still demonstrating agency.
In what way?
She's making choices,
Mm-hmm.
even if those choices are unconventional or taboo.
It's like she's saying, these are my desires, and I'm not apologizing.
Exactly. And whether you agree with her actions or not,
Right?
you have to admit there's a boldness to that.
Yeah, there is.
She owns her desires,
Mhm.
even if they go against what society says.
And this is where it gets really interesting for you, listener.
Yes.
'Cause this isn't just about one woman and what she wants.
Bigger than that.
Yeah, it's about how our personal experiences rump up against these societal expectations.
Think about it.
Okay.
We're all influenced by these messages we get
Mm-hmm.
about sex, relationships, what's appropriate.
Yeah.
This story forces us to confront those messages
Okay.
and ask if they're actually good for us.
And the fact that this is a mother and son
Oh, yeah.
just adds another layer of complexity.
does. Talk about blurred lines.
Eh.
We see this bond between them,
Yeah.
morphing to something totally different.
Right.
A transgression of boundaries,
Yeah.
this blurring of roles that would make most people really uncomfortable.
And the way she uses language makes it even more confusing.
How so?
She calls him son one minute
Uh-huh.
and then uses these super sexually charged terms the next.
Oh, interesting.
It's like she's holding on to both of those identities.
Maybe.
The mother figure and this sexually liberated woman.
Perhaps. Or maybe she's doing that on purpose.
Okay.
Blurring the lines intentionally,
Yeah.
creating a space where those traditional roles
Wow.
and expectations just don't apply anymore.
Which again speaks to this theme of control.
Exactly.
She's rewriting the rules to fit what she wants.
But it's also worth pointing out that the son isn't just passive here.
Oh, good point.
He's engaging with her desires, pushing back sometimes,
Okay.
even expressing some of his own fantasies.
So he's not just a victim.
No, he's making choices too. Even if they're influenced by the power dynamic or his own ideas about intimacy.
Right, right.
And that's what makes their whole relationship so fascinating.
Okay.
It's not simple. There's no clear right or wrong.
Yeah.
Just a lot of gray area to unpack.
It's like this tangled web.
Yeah.
The more we try to untangle it, the
Yeah.
more intricate it gets.
Exactly.
We've got power dynamics, consent issues, the influence of fantasy,
Mhm.
and all these unaddressed emotional needs.
And remember, we're just scratching the surface.
I know, right?
This story has so many layers,
Yeah.
and each one reveals something new about how people behave.
So where do we even go from here?
Well, we've talked about the power dynamics,
Mm-hmm.
the blurred lines of consent,
Right.
the influence of fantasy, and how emotions are all mixed up in this.
Yeah.
What's the next layer we need to peel back?
It's amazing how this story, even as extreme as it is,
It is.
can hold up this mirror to things we see in the real world.
Absolutely. It's
Yeah.
like a distorted reflection. Of all the messages we get about sex, intimacy, power, control,
Mm-hmm.
they're everywhere. Advertising, entertainment, social media.
It's true.
It all seeps into how we understand relationships.
It's so easy to fall into those roles.
It is.
It's like we're following a script for how we're supposed to behave.
Yeah, and sometimes those scripts are harmful.
Okay.
They perpetuate unhealthy power dynamics,
Right.
make it hard to figure out consent in a real way.
So being aware of those influences
Yes.
is crucial.
And questioning them,
Mm-hmm.
challenging them when we need to.
So bringing it back to this story,
Okay.
what are some societal things that might contributed to her need for control?
Good question.
Her use of that language, pushing those boundaries.
Right.
It feels like there's so much more going on.
Definitely. I mean, think about all the pressure women face
Okay.
to conform to certain standards
Mm,
of beauty and sexuality.
right.
It's possible she felt like she needed to reclaim her sexuality,
Okay.
assert her power in a way that defied those expectations.
And the fact that this relationship is taboo,
Yeah.
a mother and son.
Accused violation of societal norms.
Exactly. Could it be that she's rebelling against those very norms?
That's a very interesting thought.
Yeah.
And let's not forget about porn,
Right. We talked about that earlier.
especially the types that show power imbalances and extreme stuff.
Yeah.
It might have shaped how both of them
Okay.
understand sex and intimacy.
It's like they're taking those scripts from porn and acting them out in real life.
It is that blurring between fantasy and reality.
It's coming up.
It does, and that raises a really important question.
What's that?
How responsible are we as consumers of media, especially porn,
Okay.
for perpetuating harmful stereotypes and normalizing things that aren't healthy?
That's a tough one.
It is a very complex issue,
Definitely something to think about.
and one that might make some people uncomfortable.
True.
I think that means we're onto something important.
Okay.
This deep dive isn't about easy answers.
Right.
It's about getting you to think critically
Yeah.
about the messages you're getting,
Okay.
to challenge your assumptions about relationships and sexuality.
So if we were to zoom out, look at the bigger picture here.
Yeah.
What are some key takeaways you'd want our listeners to have?
I think the biggest one is to be a critical consumer of information.
Okay.
Question those messages you're bombarded with,
Yeah.
especially when it comes to sex and relationships.
Mm-hmm.
Don't just accept things at face value.
It's about recognizing those scripts
No.
we talked about earlier
yeah.
and deciding which ones we want to follow and which ones we want to rewrite.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to have open and honest conversations about these topics.
Yeah, good point.
The more we talk,
Mm-hmm.
the more we can challenge harmful norms,
Okay.
create a healthier, more equitable understanding of relationships.
Well said. I think we've reached the end of our deep dive for today
We have.
into this fascinating and complex story.
But the conversation doesn't end here.
That's right.
We've explored power dynamics, consent, the influence of fantasy,
Mm-hmm.
and all the many layers of human intimacy.
Yeah, but more than that,
Yes.
we've raised questions about how society influences us
Right.
and our own roles in shaping those influences.
Exactly.
It's a lot to think about,
It is.
and we encourage you to keep reflecting on all of this. Challenge your own assumptions
Yes.
and have honest conversations about healthy relationships.
Because ultimately, through dialogue and critical thinking, we can create a more informed and empowered understanding of ourselves and the world around us.
So until next time,
Yes.
keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.
See you then. Well, one thing that really stands out to me is how this story tackles those societal expectations
Okay.
around sex and intimacy.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's almost like she's deliberately trying to challenge them.
You know, you're right. There's that line where she talks about how women are just expected to swallow
Yes.
and not be grossed out by certain things. It feels like a direct commentary on the double standard
it is.
that women face when it comes to sexuality.
Exactly. Society often dictates how women are supposed to experience and express their sexuality.
Yeah.
And she's pushing back against that.
Hard.
Yeah, which is really interesting to unpack,
Definitely.
especially in the context of this relationship.
It definitely adds to that whole power dynamic we were talking about earlier.
It does.
Like, who gets to decide what's acceptable?
Right.
What's pleasurable? What's even considered normal?
And in this story,
Yeah.
she's taking control of that narrative.
Completely.
She is, and it's important to acknowledge that even within a dynamic that could be problematic,
Okay.
she's still showing agency.
How so?
She's making choices,
Okay.
even if those choices are unconventional or, taboo.
It's like she's saying, these are my desires, and I'm not apologizing for them.
Exactly.
Yep.
And whether you agree with her actions or not,
Mm-hmm.
you have to admit there's a certain boldness to that.
Oh, yeah.
She's not shying away,
No.
even if they go against societal norms.
And this is where it gets interesting for you, dear listener, because this isn't just about what one woman wants.
Right.
It's about how our personal experiences
Yes.
clash with these societal expectations.
We're all influenced by the messages we get about sex and relationships and what's considered appropriate.
Oh, absolutely.
This story makes us confront those messages
Okay.
and think about whether they're actually doing us any good.
And the fact that this is a mother-son relationship,
Oh, it adds a whole other layer.
isn't it? Talk about blurred lines.
Right. We see that mother-son bond turning into something completely different.
Yeah.
A transgression of boundaries, a
Right.
blurring of roles that I think most people would find really unsettling.
And even the language she uses kind of muddles things further.
How so?
Well, she calls him son in one breath
Yeah.
and then uses these incredibly sexually charged terms the next.
It's almost like she's trying to hold on to both identities at the same time. The mother figure and this sexually liberated woman.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe she's intentionally blurring the lines,
Okay.
creating this space where traditional roles and societal expectations just disappear.
Which again brings us back to that theme of control.
It does.
Like she's rewriting the rules to fit her own desires.
Exactly. And it's important to note that he's not just a passive participant in all of this.
Oh, good point.
He engages with her desires. He pushes back sometimes.
Okay.
He even expresses his own fantasies.
So he's not just a victim in this scenario.
No, he's making choices too.
Right.
Even if those choices are influenced by the power imbalance or his own, understanding of intimacy.
Right. Okay.
That's what makes their dynamic so fascinating to analyze.
Okay.
It's not a simple case of right or wrong, good or bad.
Wow.
There's so many nuances here.
Yeah. It really is like a tangled web.
It is.
The more we try to untangle it, the
Right.
more intricate it gets.
It really does.
Power dynamics, consent, the influence of fantasy, and all those unaddressed emotional needs.
And remember, we're just scratching the surface.
I know, right?
This story has so many layers.
It does.
And each layer reveals something new about human behavior.
So where do we go from here? We've talked about the power dynamics,
Right.
blurred lines of consent, the influence of fantasy, and this whole mix of emotions.
It's a lot.
It is. So what's the next layer we need to peel back?
Yeah, it really is a lot to unpack, isn't it?
It is. So much to think about.
Well, and it all ties back to something we talked about earlier,
Oh.
being a critical consumer of information.
Right, like questioning the messages we're constantly bombarded with.
Exactly, especially when it comes to sex and relationships.
Yeah, we shouldn't just accept things at face value.
Definitely not. It's about recognizing those scripts
Mm-hmm. The ones we talked about.
and making conscious choices about which ones to follow and which ones we want to rewrite.
And not being afraid to talk about it all openly and honestly.
Exactly, because the more we talk about these things,
Yeah.
the more we can challenge those harmful norms
Well, yeah.
and create a healthier, more equitable understanding of relationships.
Well said. I think we've reached the end of our deep dive today
You have.
into this fascinating and complex story, but like you said, the conversation doesn't have to end here.
It doesn't. We've explored so much. The power dynamics, the consent issues, the influence of fantasy,
Right.
and all the complexities of human intimacy.
But even more than that, I think we've raised these important questions
yeah.
about how society influences us
Absolutely.
and what role we play in shaping those influences.
Exactly. And it's a lot to process, but we hope you'll continue to reflect on all of this.
Yeah, to challenge your own assumptions about what's normal
Right.
and to have those open and honest conversations.
Yes, about what healthy relationships really look like.
Because ultimately, through dialogue, through critical thinking, through questioning the status quo, we can create a more informed and empowered understanding of ourselves and the world around us.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
So until next time,
Yes.
keep exploring, keep questioning,
Those conversations going.
and keep diving deep.
See you then.